Dr. Sharma, I'm curious about the role of women in Hinduism. Um, and I've been coming across some texts that are critical of the Hindu tradition in terms of, the way its treatment of women. And and these texts typically claim that Hinduism, as a tradition, denounces women. And I was wondering, so as a woman, I find that problematic. Um, and I was wondering if you could address that.
Yeah, sure. As a man, I find that problematic too. Yeah. Okay. So the issue then is, do Hindu sacred texts denounce women? And if so, then what does one have to say about that? There are two texts which have been, to the best of my knowledge, especially been singled out as demeaning women or not being particularly hospitable to women, certainly in the debates in India. So let me take them up as representative of that genre. One of them is a very well-known Hindi version of the Ramayana, known as the Ramcharit-manas. It's an extremely popular sacred text in northern India, in the Hindi-speaking regions, which was composed in medieval times by one Tulsidas. At one point in that text, a character says that these objects are worthy of being beaten. A drum, a rustic, an animal, a menial person, menial servant, and woman. It is a notorious passage. And then there is the Manu Smriti, a text composed according to modern scholars, or at least dated by modern scholars, to around 2nd century AD, which is in Sanskrit. And it's the best known law book, so to say, within Hinduism. So the point I would like to make in relation to both these references is that one has to look at the text in context. If you look at a text without the context, this can lead to misunderstanding, even alienation. So what is the context for the first statement about those who are worthy of being beaten and so on? Now in the text, this statement is made by a marginal character, not one of the central characters. It is made by the ocean. Ocean is personified. And the ocean was resisting to the request of the hero Ram to allow his troops to pass over it into Lanka to fight the demon. So it was obstructing their passage. And then I think Ram threatens to dry it up, and then it appears before Ram, the hero, humbled. And then it says this. It is put in his mouth. The verse is put in his mouth. This is not put in the mouth of a person from whom you receive your knowledge of ethical norms. It's a recalcitrant character who is ultimately brought to book and then who says, maybe your use of force, threat of force, was justified. And people like this are worthy of being subjected to that force. And then he mentions all of these. So it is not as if a major figure in that narrative is upholding this as an ideal. It is a minor character actually trying to excuse himself by identifying himself with these kinds of people for the way it has behaved. It is not being upheld as a norm. It is not a prescription, it's a description. Yeah? So I think it would be unfair to deduce from this that this is what the poet or the text wants one, this is the way it wants one to behave. The parts of the text which tell us how to behave are text verses which say, nothing is impossible in this world for those whose heart is set on doing good to others. These are the kind of verses which are put in the mouth of the high characters in the narrative. Yeah? So one has to keep that in mind. But the more interesting response, I'd always wondered that Indian women don't seem to be so perturbed by ordinary Indian women lead their lives happily as Hindus. They hear these descriptions but are not perturbed by them the way feminists are. I was always intrigued by this, like my mother and others. I discovered that they have their own ways of dealing with this situation. So I remember one occasion on which somebody was quoting this verse. And the response from one of the women was, okay, one down for me and two down for you. He said, what do you mean? He said, people worthy of being beaten is a woman and a rustic and a menial servant. I mean, you are behaving as a member of that class by citing this verse in the presence of women. So the verse says that these are worthy of, capable of, they shan't be beaten up. Drum, rustic, menial servant, animal. Actually, she said three. And we are behaving like an animal. So you qualify on three counts. I only on one. I was quite taken with this because she was not fazed at all. This was her comeback. Which leads me to the second point, in relationship to the Manusmriti especially, which has passages of denunciation and all. One has to keep in mind that these are law books. The Smritis are law books. And there is a school of Hindu philosophy which tells us how these texts are to be understood, the rules for understanding these texts. And one text of that school is called the Mimamsa Sutras. There is a commentary on these texts, these sutras, Mimamsa Sutras. They are usually placed in the 4th century BCE. The commentary is, I think, 2nd century AD by a person called Shabar. I'm sharing all these details with you because these are not widely known outside the tradition. And although I am a student of the tradition, even I came to know about this relatively late in life. One point he says in his commentary on this text that a thing censored in the text is not censored to censor it, but to recommend its opposite. Nahi ninda nindyam ninditum prayujyate. I am missing the exact word, but prasanshitam, to praise the opposite. That is to say, the denunciation of women is not meant to denounce women, but to praise the opposite. What does this mean? To praise renunciation of the world. When the texts say negative things about the world or women, their intention is not to denounce what they are denouncing, but to praise the opposite. Now, these are meant to be rules of interpreting the text. What I'm trying to say is that to the outside reader, this may make perfect sense from what one reads and says, oh, this is what is being said. But if you are trying to look at the tradition from within the tradition itself, then this is what the tradition tells you of how such passages are to be understood. What way are they to be taken? And in this, I think I find the explanation of my puzzle as to why Indian traditional women are not fazed by this. They somehow intuit that the purpose, that without knowing it in that formally, that this is not the real issue. This is not what is really going on. The rules of understanding. Now, the final part of the response has to do with the fact that there are many texts in which they are lauded. In the Manusmriti itself, they are lauded. At certain parts, they are praised. And in the Tantra, they are extolled to the skies. So Hinduism being what it is, representing all shades of veneer and all, has all these texts. So this all comes down to which text, what context, and what is the prescriptive value of what is being said. So this is my long answer, sort of to your short question, but I think it demanded that.
Mm-hmm. 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 There are just maybe there are maybe two things that sort of still bother me about that.
Sure.
One is that you sort of addressing a systemic issue, like a systemic problem of oppression, by pointing to individuals and saying like, well, these individuals don't have a problem with it. And I think, I can understand that argument, but I think it also kind of doesn't do justice to the fact that that might be a systemic problem, and that you can, as an individual, still internalize a kind of normal, that this is just normal,
Yeah. Now, my response to that is that before we attack a problem, we have to identify its real dimension. Right? The real dimension of the problem is that, yes, there are provisions in law of inheritance in which women were left out. These are there in the text. These things don't apply to that. Nothing is being praised, right? Yeah. If it is perceived that the problem is the denunciation of women, then it's a red herring in the light of what I have said. This is my basic point in this context, that we have to get to the real problem. Such passages are not the problem, according to the tradition. Right? If you look at it from the tradition, this is a problem from our justice in any context. Now there have been ways, there may have been reasons, ways in which they might have justified this in the past as to why women have certain rights or don't. Yeah. And they may be adequate or inadequate. But this is a real issue. So we have to go for the real issue. And that is where one has to understand that going after these passages and then generalizing from that. Now, this is kind of a subtle thing. For instance, people have remarked upon this, that in South Asia, there has been an acceptance of female political leaders. In India, in Bangladesh, yeah, in Pakistan. This tells us something about their standing. There is no political opposition. And if the view, expressed here now, that Mrs. Clinton's failure to get elected may have had a misogynistic element in it. I don't know how far it's true or not. And that overcoming two isms, racism with Obama and sexism with Mrs. Clinton, was too heavy a weight for the moral back of America to carry in succession. Right? Becomes very suggestive. There was no such problem when the leadership issues about political leadership of women by women emerged in India. So that the point I'm trying to make is that if you look at the Hindu issues, the issues in Hinduism from a Hindu point of view, in the sense Hindu point of view, by which I mean, how does the tradition handle it? And then you come to the genuine issues. Now, I think there's a genuine issue in the tradition. The study of the Vedas, the sacred scriptures of Hinduism, this study became inaccessible to women and to the Shudras. But since we are dealing with women, I'll focus on that. Formally, from around 4th century BCE. Now, I regard that as a genuine issue. Although in the tradition, there is an attempt to argue that the exclusion was really an exemption. Is that making sense? That they were asked not to, their access was denied to them because they were really being not excluded but exempted from doing all the kind of ritual activities which male members of the higher castes have to undergo to maintain themselves in a state of ritual purity to study those texts. Now, this is the argument given within the tradition. We might see that as an attempt to justify the exclusion as exemption. But I think it still remains an issue as to why should they have been denied, formally denied this right. Now, I am not saying that they have to study that. If they don't want to, it should have been up to them. They say, oh, well, they were busy in domestic duties. Okay. So it's up to them. They may not use that right. But the right should not have been denied. So, I mean, there are genuine issues in the matters of some provisions in law. And there might be issues of a kind which you might not relish, because there are provisions at places where women are, in some parts of the legal tradition, where the punishment for adultery is minimal, because they say women's character is so bad, what can you do?
They say women's character is so bad, what can you do?
In the sense that is a legally positive provision, light punishment, is based on a highly negative assessment of their character. So these are the kind of things I would rather take issue with, rather than just because in some text we have these kinds of verses in that context.
So I think the question would be, I think the question that I would pose to you would be, you're saying that there are structural, systemic problems of sort of, oppression of women within the whole thing. But are those necessarily coming out of the text? I mean, out of...
Yes, the issue is, there's a very fundamental issue here. When the position of women and description of women are attacked by feminists and so on, the issue is not so much that people don't accept that there are passages like this, a negative portrayal. And even in this case, we must disregard all that I have said as a special pleading from within the tradition and say, okay, but these are these passages. The real issue is whether you have confidence in the ability of the tradition itself to correct these issues or not. Right? This is the real issue. People within the tradition are not saying that these criticisms are not valid.
Right. Well, I would have less confidence in the tradition to correct those issues, thinking that, that maybe the argument would be, oh, you're excluded based on, your privilege or your, or your kind of, whatever the opposite of privilege is.
And here there's a very fundamental point involved. As I see it, all the major traditions of the world, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, if we speak of the Indian traditions of Indian origin, and then Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have long histories through which I think they have displayed their ability to, so to say, to rise to the occasion and to deal with the challenge in front of those traditions, in whatever form it takes. So the danger here is to regard to subliminally regard the history of the tradition as exhausting its potential.
Right, as static, so that the tradition would...
That, in the past it has not been able to do this or that. So. But each tradition contains a quality which exceeds its contents. Otherwise it wouldn't be what it is. So the real question is whether you have enough confidence in this quality of the tradition to reformulate itself in the face of these challenges. Now look at what is happening in India now. I told you how women could not study the Vedas. Nowadays, in the classes in the universities where the Vedas are taught, 50% of the students are women. there has been no rumble. It has happened.
And how about instructors and professors?
And they are also instructors every day. There are individual instructors who refuse even now on traditional grounds to teach them, coach them. But there are many others who are freely doing this.
Oh, and I think, I meant what in terms of female instructors who are teaching?
There are female priests.
Female priests, yeah. I think, yeah, if I would have confidence, I mean, this isn't about whether or not I have confidence in the tradition, but I think confidence in a tradition to change also is bound up with the kind of leadership, with what leadership looks like, whether it's, there's some kind of parity or some kind of equal opportunity within the leadership for men and women, or,
Yeah. So this ultimately comes down to an assessment of our ability of the tradition to resolve those issues satisfactorily. The secular outlook tends to discount the ability of religions to do so. It's the very nature of the secular outlook.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have a problem there, because I have greater confidence on the basis of my familiarity, the limited familiarity with the major religious traditions, that they do seem to possess this ability. Now, they may not always be able to manifest it. So it's not as if, always work out and all. But one has to initially accept the proposition that they may be able to, on the basis of the track record. Because they have changed through history. Most would think that they have changed for the better, when required. But it's a matter of judgment call.